Hello, Tom Simmons here with another installment of Economics with Tully, and the subject of today's video, looking at sports economics in particular, is we're going to look at the structure of the NFL and the revenue streams inherent in football as opposed to the other major professional sports leagues. Starting out by saying the NFL, the National Football League, is, as many of you have probably heard from a lot of things that are traveling around on the internet, is actually a non-profit organization. But it's important to point out that the NFL is not a non-profit organization the way that other non-profits are organized. For instance, a local VFW hall, a non-profit school, a research facility, a church, a charitable organization. Those types of organizations are organized under a section of the Internal Revenue Code called 501c3, and that means they're a charitable organization. The NFL is not organized under that section of the Internal Revenue Code, even though everyone says, oh, they're a nonprofit. They're actually organized under section 501c6, which is not for charitable organizations. It's very specifically for business organizations. And the reason that some business organizations are allowed to organize as a nonprofit is because rather than having the central organization, the NFL, pay all the taxes in the league, the profit that is made is distributed among the various teams, and then each team, as an individual business, pays tax on its profit. And one of the reasons that many people prefer that is because you've got 32 different NFL teams in many different states, and that means they're paying income tax in all those different states where they play. If the league made all the money instead of the teams, then the league would pay state income tax in the one state where the league was organized. And so many states would lose on tax revenue. So don't be fooled by people who are saying, oh, the NFL is non-profit and they don't pay taxes. They do pay taxes. It's just that the league itself doesn't. It's distributed to the teams. The teams then pay the taxes. And because the teams are located in many different states get the benefit of those income taxes. Now, having said that the NFL is organized as a nonprofit, they still obviously have all of these teams that are part of the league, and it's been that way since 1920, I believe. And when the NFL started as a league back in 1920, they gave the commissioner at the top a lot of authority, more authority than in many of the other professional sports leagues. For instance, the current commissioner, Roger Goodell, was elected by, you have to be elected by 2/3 of the owners of the teams, has the authority to settle disputes between players, between coaches, between employees, between clubs. He has the right to negotiate the TV contracts on behalf of the entire NFL. He has the right to discipline teams and players, suspend teams and players, fine teams and players, and he has the right to recommend, as any of the commissioners would, the right to recommend the cancellation of a club franchise. And it's a very powerful, it's a very strong position, one of the strongest of all the sports leagues, and it really gives some authority to the league at the top levels, at the highest levels, to direct what this sport is going to look like, what its brand image is going to look like, how they're going to portray that brand image, and how they're going to create this business. That's not to say that the owners do not have some degree of independent authority as well. They do, and we're going to be looking at that through the course of this this particular lecture. I'm coming to you today from Williamstown, New Jersey, less than 30 minutes from the city of Philadelphia. I am deep in the heart of Philadelphia Eagles territory. In fact, I'm told by my friends here in Williamstown that on any given Sunday afternoon during the football season, which we are in the middle of right now, it's about 50 degrees out here, you can hear the screams and the cheers and the yelling going on from the houses all around this lake as it echoes and bounces off the different sides of the lake. And I raise that because the Philadelphia Eagles are actually responsible for one of the most now time-honored processes in many of the leagues, not just football, and that is the reverse order draft, which actually was initiated at the request of the Philadelphia Eagles. And I'll actually be ending my video today by just talking about that story briefly. So, in looking at the revenue streams that come into the NFL, well, let's look at gate receipts first. And you might expect that in baseball, which was the subject of my last video, since they have 81 home games every season, whereas football teams only have 8 home games every season, that baseball probably draws in more in terms of gate receipts. And in fact, big market baseball, with those 81 home games per season, do in fact generate the highest revenue of all the different sports leagues. But the difference between the highest generating revenue teams and the lowest is big. In fact, the baseball teams that draw in the highest gate receipts receive 12 times the amount of gate receipts that the lowest gate receipt drawing teams in baseball do. There is major discrepancy between the popular teams and the not so popular teams. Not that way in football. In fact, the NFL has the smallest of all the differences in terms of ticket sales, gate receipts, of all the sports. The Cowboys, which are generally the highest grossing gate receipt team in the NFL, they only draw 2.7 times the ticket revenue of the Oakland Raiders, which is the lowest. So that gives you a sense that baseball is much more divergent in terms of how much money they're drawing in from selling tickets. Part of this is because football draws near capacity crowds. On average, every single stadium in the NFL was at least 3/4 full last year. And that's something that has only been achieved by 11 of all baseball teams. So football is obviously, by having fewer games, fewer home games, they're selling out more. So the amount of money they're all taking in terms of ticket sales is going to be a capacity stadium crowd amount, and it's not going to be that different team to team. The other major reason is because of the way gate revenue is distributed in the NFL. The NFL has absolutely the most generous gate receipt sharing system of all the sports. And it didn't happen. It actually wasn't planned this way. It kind of happened. They stumbled into it. For the first 16 years of the NFL's existence, from 1920 through 1935, the NFL never fielded the same set of teams in 2 consecutive years. Teams came, team went. It was very hard to keep stability and keep the same teams every single year from season to season. So faced with all that instability, they decided we need to do something to help the teams that are struggling, that are having trouble, to give them an incentive to stick around, to stick it out, and to stay and to grow. And what they ended up doing was instituting a policy whereby A home team in the NFL keeps 60% of their gate receipts. So you sell out a stadium, you're only keeping 60% of your ticket money. The other 40%, which is a significant amount, as I said, it's the most generous of all the leagues, goes directly to the league headquarters, where it's put in a single large pool. And then that pool of gate receipts is distributed among all the teams equally. So that a team that doesn't sell, if for some reason they're not selling a lot of tickets, they're still going to get a good chunk of gate receipts from the pooled contributions of all the other teams. And it makes things a little more even between the teams, creates a little more balance between the teams, makes sure that a local team that is struggling is going to get a little bit more of a leg up to continue to go forward and compete within the league. So that's the gate receipt scenario. The media scenario is probably even more different than baseball. As you recall from my baseball video, baseball teams get to keep local broadcast revenue. If a game is broadcast, if someone's buying the broadcast rights locally, that local team is keeping the vast majority of that revenue. In the NFL, the media contracts are national. They are negotiated by the national office. The money all goes to the National League, and then it is distributed equally among the teams. So the local teams don't have to worry about jacking up the amount of money they're making from local broadcast revenues in order to keep money. Because what's simply going to happen is all the money goes into one big pool at the league level, and then it's redistributed. The practical reality of that is that football is able to have leagues in places that baseball never could. For instance, you've got a football team in Green Bay, Wisconsin. There are no significantly large media outlets in Green Bay, Wisconsin to purchase a lucrative media rights broadcast contract with that team. But Green Bay doesn't need it because the media markets in New York and Chicago that are paying to the NFL, all of that is getting distributed equally to all of these different teams in the league. And that means whereas baseball has to locate, their teams have to be located in large media markets because they're drawing so much of their personal local revenue from local TV broadcasts. Football doesn't worry about it because the broadcast is handled on a national basis and everyone benefits equally from it. To give you an example of how that plays out, all right? Last year, Major League Baseball teams received about $23.8 million per team from shared media revenue. NBA teams received about $31 million, and the NHL hockey league, each team received about $7.8 million in shared broadcast revenues. In the NFL, each team received $184 million in broadcast revenue from the national contract. And that means that structure is working to really generate revenue for individual teams, no matter whether they do poorly or well, no matter where they're located, no matter what their media market is, and each team gets a good chunk of cash regardless of all those other factors. Now, another revenue stream for leagues, besides the gate receipts and the broadcast receipts, is the licensing, meaning the licensing of the logos. When a clothing company wants to have a baseball or a hockey or an NFL logo on clothing in order to sell it, they have to pay the team or the league a certain amount of funds for licensing. Now, this is an area that's actually changing in football, and it's related to the antitrust discussion that we had in baseball in the last video. It used to be that the NFL actually contracted with a lot of different clothing companies, to make apparel with NFL logos or with individual team logos. And they awarded these contracts to a lot of different places. Well, a few years ago, they decided to stop doing that. And they said, we are going to award the right to make NFL logo clothing, caps, other material, only to Reebok International. So one of the companies that they used to deal with, American Needle, sued. And they sued them under the Sherman Antitrust Act. You see, this is an issue you're just never going to get away from, regardless of the sport we're talking about. And they said that NFL's exclusive contract to only allow one company to make their clothing and pay the license fee was a restraint of trade, that it restrained competition, and it was prohibited under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prohibits monopolization and restraint of trade. Now, based on the last video, you know that several times this issue has gone all the way to the Supreme Court in the context of baseball. And the Supreme Court has always said that baseball is exempt from the Sherman Antitrust Act. Well, football, the NFL, also went all the way to the Supreme Court on this issue. And they said if baseball is exempt from the Sherman Antitrust Act because they're a sport engaged in interstate commerce and the act was not supposed to cover them, football is no different. And the NHL and the NBA had their lawyers write briefs, which are legal documents, in support of the NFL, saying if baseball is exempt, then football should be exempt too. There's really no difference between the two. Well, interestingly enough, the Supreme Court ruled, and they didn't just rule, but they ruled unanimously, that the NFL is not exempt from the Sherman Antitrust Act, and by awarding an exclusive contract to Reebok and no one else, that was a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. In fact, May 24th, 2010, Justice Stevens specifically wrote the following, which is important in terms of our discussion as to the relationship between the teams in the league. He wrote, although NFL teams have common interests, such as promoting a single NFL brand, so he's recognizing the oneness, the unity of football, they're still separate profit-maximizing entities. So now he's recognizing the individuality of each of the teams. And their interest in licensing team trademarks are not necessarily aligned, meaning the interests the Philadelphia Eagles have may not be exactly the same as the interest that the Dallas Cowboys have. And so it would make sense to permit different companies to work with different teams, or work on different logos, different apparel, and there's no need, no right to monopolize and say only Reebok can do this. That decision came out in 2010, unanimous Supreme Court decision. So that aspect of NFL revenue is in flux because it used to come from various sources, then they moved to one source, and now it's going back to various sources all over again. And how that's distributed and collected is still yet to be determined. Now, another stream of revenue that we haven't discussed yet are preseason revenues and revenues that the local team gets to keep as part of their pool that they don't have to share. And these revenues are often collected before the season even begins. So one way to do this, for instance, is through a mechanism called personal seat licenses. Once upon a time, you probably thought, well, if I want to go to a game, I simply go and I buy a ticket for that game. Or if I want tickets for the season, then just before the season starts, I buy my seats, whatever seats they are, for the whole season. And in both of those cases, those are ticket sales. Those are gate receipts. Those are game tickets. And they would be shared just like any other game ticket would be. Well, what some clubs began to do is offer something for sale called personal seat licenses. These are not tickets. They're not season tickets. They're not individual game tickets. They're not individual seats. What they are is they will charge you for the right to order your tickets first. It's like buy a ticket so you can be first online to order tickets when you want to. Under the NFL's rules, those are not seat tickets themselves. They're not gate receipts themselves, because you're not buying the seat, you're not buying a ticket, you're simply buying the right to be able to be first online once those tickets really are offered. And you may choose not to buy tickets at that point. Those are stadium receipts, and they stay 100% with the home team. At this point, half of all the teams in the NFL have begun selling personal seat licenses. There's only a handful, 5 or less, in all of the other major sports. But in the NFL, this particular approach has taken off, and people pay thousands of dollars just to have the right to be at the head of the line to buy their tickets once they go on sale. The revenue is not shared, and it stays home. So that becomes another way to generate revenue that you don't have to share. What's also interesting about that is that when a team builds a new stadium, they need usually to begin paying on their loan before the stadium even opens, because they'll get their loan to build a huge stadium, and it's starting to collect interest, and they need to start making payments, and they haven't even had their first season yet. Well, where do they get their money from? Well, one way to do that is to sell these PSLs, these personal seat licenses, because the seats don't even have to be in place yet for them to sell you the right to buy a ticket later on. So it's one way to get money up front. Of course, another way to get money up front, once you do have a stadium, even if the season hasn't opened, is by preseason games. Special exhibition games, special preseason games that don't count yet, because in preparing players for the upcoming season, players get training camp salaries. So if you're seeing a preseason game, those players are actually making less per week than I am as a teacher. They're getting training salaries. They're not getting the big money that you're used to associating with a football player. But the team management is selling, full price tickets to see these. Or they're saying in order to buy a package of X number of season tickets, you also have to include 2 preseason games in that package. The reason they do that is because preseason is not season, and gate receipts or ticket sales for those games do not have to be shared. It's another way to have low costs. You have to practice anyway. You're paying low salaries, but you're getting full price for your ticket, and you get to keep it. So, 2 different mechanisms. The PSL, especially if you're constructing a stadium, or the preseason game, is a way to get those gate receipts in and keep them local. So, lastly, the last thing I'd like to touch on, and I alluded to this in the very beginning of this video, is an incident that happened with the Philadelphia Eagles, since I'm right down here in Eagles territory. And the reason this is important, this reverse entry draft, is because the ability of a team to generate broadcast revenues, to generate gate receipts, to generate stadium revenue, to generate licensing revenue, is to be a team that people like, is to be a team that has fans, is to be a team that people are loyal to and want to support. Well, what happens if you are the perennial loser? Well, going back to 1934, the very beginning of organized football, really, there was a bidding war for a player named Stan Koska, who was an All-American fullback at the University of Minnesota. And several teams were bidding on him. They all wanted him. He was a great runner. And back then, actually, football teams ran the ball much more frequently than today. They passed the ball less, and they ran the ball with far more frequency. And this guy was a good runner. And the two teams that wanted Koska most were the Brooklyn Dodgers. Yes, I know. The Brooklyn Dodgers were also a football team, besides being a baseball team, and the Philadelphia Eagles. And they began bidding against one another for this guy, and Brooklyn finally bid the price up to an astounding, you ready for this? $5,000, which you may laugh at, but at the time, it was the highest salary in all of football. No one made $5,000. That was crazy. And the Eagles owner, Bert Bell, was furious because the team had not been doing well, and he needed some stars, and this was his chance, and he lost it. And so Bell went to the other players and said, I have an idea. Every single team deserves an equal shot at getting good players. And it's not fair that the teams that have lots and lots of money to spend are able to just buy the best players. And we should do something different about this. And so his suggestion, and this is a quote, this is his suggestion, teams would select the rights to unsigned players with the order of selection determined by each team's performance in the previous season. So in other words, you look at the standings in the previous football season, and the team that had the worst record, they got to choose first. And you went in reverse order from the worst team in the league to the best in terms of choosing new players. The owners actually loved the idea, and they said that's one way to make sure that one team doesn't dominate, and that the teams that have the hardest time are able to get some stars and maybe generate interest, enthusiasm, and, of course, revenue. So they did it the next year. 1936, they actually began the reverse order draft pick. Philadelphia began, they were the last, and they began, picking their players. Still struggle for the next few years, but by 1943, they had their first winning season ever. Then they had 7 winning seasons in a row, including 2 championships. The reverse order draft was a hit as a way to even the excitement and the enthusiasm between all the different teams, and as a way to make sure that everyone had an equal shot. It is now the norm. Reverse order draft is a norm in almost all the sports across the spectrum. Started here in Philadelphia as a way to make sure every team had an equal ability to participate in the fruits of the game. Same way that shared gate receipts do, same way that a shared national media contract does. NFL has by far, again, been the most generous in terms of sharing, in terms of seeing everyone as being in the same boat, so to speak, and needing to help each other in order to have good competitive balance, good seasons, and good excitement and enthusiasm from the fans. Tom Simmons, signing off on the NFL video.